If you have any questions about any of these announcements, again, feel free to email us here at the Spirit of Lotus. Today's discourse is a continuation on the topic of releasing guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are two things that really go hand in hand. In fact, they're so intertwined that this morning we actually had to look up the definition of these two concepts to make sure we knew exactly what the difference was between the two. So as I understand it, guilt it's something associated with behavior, thoughts, words, or actions that you have done. So a particular behavior you have done, you feel guilty about that behavior. Whereas shame is something that you relate to the self. So because of certain action or thoughts or words that you may feel guilty about, shame is, I am bad because I did those things. Not that the action itself is bad and I shouldn't have done it, but I am bad because I did it. So again, these two concepts are very intertwined. Many times they go together. If you think about the definitions I just gave, you can't have shame without guilt. It is possible to have guilt, though, without shame. Guilt, you might know that the action is bad, but you may not feel shameful about the particular action. One thing to keep in mind about guilt and shame is that I feel confident that pretty much every human being has at some point or another felt guilt and shame. These things are really part of the human experience, and it would be very difficult to avoid experiencing them in your lifetime. This is mainly because we live in this world of Maya, glamour, and illusion. As you all know, who have been attending the services or listening via Ustream for the past couple of weeks, it's because of this illusion and this Maya and this glamour, we're so tempted by it. We're so desirous of it. But it causes suffering if we act on it. And part of this suffering is guilt and shame. And something that might clear this up a little bit is what the Buddha apparently was telling some of his disciples as part of his teaching. So the Buddha analogized the world we live in of this Maya, glamour, and illusion as it's like bait on the end of a hook. And the bait being this illusion, Maya, and glamour. And when you have this bait on the end of the hook in the river of life, the bait is so appealing to us. It looks so delicious. It is so enticing. We're so desirous of it that we eventually grab onto the bait. The moment we do that, however, is we realize that this bait comes with something else, and that's the hook. And the hook gets stuck in our mouth, and now we're hooked. That's the suffering, which is caused by the illusion, Maya, and glamour, which is the bait. And that suffering, again, as I just mentioned, can involve many different things, but it can include guilt and shame. Sometimes, despite our best intentions, we simply cannot avoid grabbing onto the bait. Another analogy which might be useful is, let's take a very, very thirsty man or woman. And they come to this oasis. And in the oasis is this beautiful, calm pond, clear water. And they're thinking, oh my gosh, look at the water. I'm so thirsty. All I have to do now is go down to that little pond and take a drink out of it, and my thirst is going to be washed away. I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be content. So as you walk into this oasis and you walk down to the pond, there's a gentleman sitting there. And the gentleman says, don't drink out of the pond. It's poisonous. So you think about that for a little bit, but you just can't help yourself. You're so thirsty. You're so desirous of the water in the pond. You think it's going to make everything better. So you reach down, you take a cup of the pond water and you drink it, and sure enough, it's poisonous and causes you more pain and more suffering than you had when you entered that oasis. This is the difficulty that we are dealing with in terms of this world of Maya, glamour, and illusion. And if we act on temptation, the result of it is suffering and problematic for us. Guilt and shame, one of the main obstacles that guilt and shame cause for us is separation. Separation from our true selves, which of course leads to separation from God, because we are God. For those of you who attended yesterday's class on cultivating soul powers with Reverend Tara, you heard her talk about the conscience. And she taught us that if your conscience is not clear, then you will not be able to create in this world. At least not create in the manner in which you might intend. Your creation will not be clear because your conscience is not clear. And because your conscience is not clear, you are not tied in a pure way to the all possibility. And you don't have a clear conscience if you are suffering from guilt and shame. You must release yourself from guilt and shame in order for you to create and manifest on this physical plane. At least create and manifest in a way that you intend to. So the question then becomes, how do I or we release ourselves from guilt and shame so that there is no separation between our true self and between us and God, and so that we can manifest all of our dreams, our desires in this physical reality? I would like to put forth a three-step process for doing this. So step number one, in terms of releasing guilt and shame, is to realize that you have the power to do that. In fact, you are the only one with the power to release yourself from guilt and shame. Nobody else can do this for you. No master can do it for you. Nobody can do it for you. Only you yourself can release yourself from guilt and shame. So that's step number one, a recognition that only you have this power. Step number two is And this is where a lot of us fall into a trap. We may realize that we have the power to release ourselves from guilt and shame, but we are not willing to do it. So it's recognition of the power. That's step one. Step two is willingness to release yourself from guilt and shame. The trap that I was talking about that people fall into is they just can't bring themselves to do it. They want to continue to beat themselves with the ugly stick, to feel bad about themselves, to punish themselves, and they are simply not willing to release themselves from guilt and shame. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on in the discourse. So step three is, and I'm going to quote from the Lord's Prayer. I'm going to recommend that everybody get the Lord's Prayer, take it out and read it, or if you've already have it memorized, then go through it in your mind. And there's a particular part of the Lord's Prayer that I want to focus on, and that's the part about forgiveness. In the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who have trespassed against us." I'll be the first to admit the Lord's Prayer does not mention guilt, does not mention shame, but it is in part talking about those two things and telling us that if we want to realize our God selves, if we want to ascend, we must forgive. The forgiveness is what frees us. If you don't forgive, whatever you haven't forgiven, whether it's yourself, another person, something that happened, you are tied to that person, place, event forever if you don't forgive. It is like an anchor tied around your soul. And if you have one or more of these anchors tied around your soul, you will not be able to ascend up the mountain of enlightenment. You will not be able to go through the eye of the needle. These things will prevent you from doing that. There's an example of how this is put into practice. We all know, or most of us know, the story of the prostitute. And she's in a town square. And there's people in the town square, including the Christ. And a lot of the people want to stone this prostitute because she's a prostitute. And they're judging her for what she has done. And as many of you know, Christ says, ye who is out without sin can cast the first stone. Eventually the crowd disperses, and left there is just the prostitute and Christ. So the Christ he's kneeling down and he's drawing in the sand, as the story goes. He's drawing some symbols in the sand, and the prostitute comes over and asks the Christ, "What should I do now?" Does Christ tell her that, well, the first thing you should do is feel guilty about being a prostitute? And the next thing you should do is feel shame about it. You should think to yourself, I'm a bad person because I was a prostitute. And for the remainder of your life, you should beat yourself up about being a prostitute. You should feel guilty about it. You should continue to feel shame about it. And that's how you should conduct the rest of your life. Well, we all know that is not what the Christ said. He looked up from drawing on the sand, glanced at her, and he simply said, "Don't do it again." That's it. And the implied message there is to the prostitute, forgive yourself, move on, and that is not going to hold you back from anything, from entering God's kingdom, from being whatever you want to be. Forgive, move on, and don't do it again. There's actually research. I'm not sure if you are aware of it, but there's research about guilt and shame. And you know what the research shows? That people who feel guilt and shame are more apt in the future to do something which causes more guilt and more shame. And these are studies, scientific studies done by psychologists. And when you think about it, it's really not too surprising. And why do I say that? What you pay attention to is what you energize in your life, and what you energize in your life is what you become. So if you're focused in your life on being guilty or feeling shameful, you are literally energizing that in your life. You are making that an integral part of your life that you will not be able to escape. And you are the one creating it. It is only through forgiveness, recognition that you have the power to forgive, willingness to forgive yourself, and then actually forgiving yourself that you can free yourself from this. I am not suggesting here, by the way, that certain actions, which most of us would think are bad, you have a free pass to do those actions. I'm not saying go out and murder someone, and then as long as you forgive yourself, that's fine. What I'm saying is there are bad actions. You have to recognize that those actions are bad, and ideally, you're not going to do them. But if you do them, your only recourse at that point in time, if you want to free your soul, is forgiveness and is to move on. Why aren't more of us willing to forgive ourselves? When you think about it, we're the ones that are making that decision. And we're the only ones that can make that decision. So all of us have this. We all have the ugly stick that we want to beat ourselves up with, and we want to punish ourselves with it. But think of all the wasted time and energy doing that. Do you really need to spend more time than what I did, what I said, what I thought was not right? I'm not doing it again. And move on, versus what I did, what I said, what I thought was not right, and now I have to spend the next week or two, maybe a month, maybe the rest of my life punishing myself for it, refusing to forgive myself for it, chaining myself to this physical reality, preventing myself from ascending, and literally guaranteeing that I will not get off the cycle of rebirth and have to come back and try it all over again in the next life. So I would recommend that we all take control of our lives. Realize that we have the power to release ourselves from guilt and shame. Take the next step and be willing to do it and forgive ourselves. Truly forgive ourselves. Thereby freeing us, freeing our souls, so that we can recognize who and what we are, our true God self, that we are God. So with that, I will leave you all, and at least in terms of the discourse, and we'll move on to a